So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for part 2 of our Mental Health for Human Rights and Humanitarian Actors. Today, we're going to be focusing on vicarious trauma. Now, for some of you, this might be a new subject area. For others, it might be something that you're quite familiar with. But thankfully, we have the wonderful Erika, who's sacrificing her very early morning, or perhaps continuing on from the night before to come and present on this topic for us today. So thank you so much again, Erika, for your time. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk through this topic with us. It's very, very important. And also building on what we looked at before in the previous webinar when we were talking about stress and recognizing what are the symptoms of stress, and perhaps what does prolonged stress look like, and what does it do to our bodies, our lives, our coping mechanisms. And well, for me especially, I found some really, really practical just tips and tools for managing our general health and well-being while we're trying to address stress in the workplace. And it builds really, really nicely to this next session that we'll be focusing on today, because, in our work, a lot of our job is constantly hearing about the trauma of others, and that eventually takes its toll, whether you're conducting an investigation or you're perhaps listening to complaints or you're talking with your stakeholders. There is this risk of vicarious trauma, which we'll find out a little bit more about today, and how we can potentially address that. So I think it's a really important topic. And once again, we're really happy that Erika is here and available for us today.
So today we're going to talk about vicarious trauma, which every time I do this discussion, out of a group of 20, there's always 2 people who tell me, I cried the whole way through the session. I didn't know what was wrong with me. So more than the stress one, this is the one people doing this work really recognize in themselves. So so let me just start. This is a quote from Audre Lorde, which I really am trying to get right through to anyone doing this work, to internalize it in every cell of your body, because it is very difficult to think of yourself in the face of other people's suffering. So it's really important to try to fully let this in. Caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that's an act of political warfare. If you collapse through a lack of self-care in the face of other people's suffering, you can't keep doing the work. And we need everybody to be able to continue to do the work. So to see it as, whereas when other people are suffering, people just go, oh, but like I have to keep doing, and don't think of themselves at all until they hit a crisis. And the problem then is people are angry and they don't care about anybody anymore. So in order to keep it up long term, we need to take care of ourselves. Now, my goal today is that you understand the differences and signs and symptoms of secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, and to know what you can do to help or ameliorate the conditions. Sorry, I've OHCHR in there. Human rights people are regularly exposed to what the worst of humanity does to each other, which is not a normal environment for us to be in. It's one thing if you are in a context yourself and the place goes through a war or whatever, there comes an end at some point to that. But when you do this work, you go from one crisis place to another crisis place to another crisis place. And it's just this endless stream of pain and misery where, which can really impact us. And there's no magic bullet that will protect your heart from how you might react to human suffering. So, you can't be fully prepared, but self-care goes a long way to, I suppose, be a protection mechanism around you, and so that you have longevity in the work. So the last time I showed this depiction, I think it's, as I said, the last day, I think it's a really good example of the difference between stress, worry, and anxiety. So when we are stressed, we have lots of thoughts in our heads, lots of demands. I have to do this, I have to do that, I can't get this done. It's a kind of a feeling of pressure, more demands than you have time or energy for, or at one given time, more negativity than you have energy for. worry is like a shot of adrenaline that goes through the body. And we all know that fear, if we think something has happened to someone we love, it goes right through our bodies. But it's just a wave, right? Whereas anxiety is a lot of negative thoughts, a sense of doom, like something really bad is just about to happen, and a whole load of physiological symptoms, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, trauma is an extended version of that. So an anxiety attack is a sense that something really bad is going to happen. Panic attack is a feeling like you're going to die right now. Have these things long enough, you're on your way to burnout and or vicarious trauma. So we want to explain the difference. So secondary trauma occurs when you relate to someone who's undergone a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events to such an extent that just hearing the story traumatizes you. It happens in one sitting, and you develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is something that, at different times, you might even have a lot of experience at different times. You hear stories all the time and you're okay. And then there's a particular story or a particular child or a particular person that just hearing their thing is very traumatic for you, impacts your whole nervous system. An example of secondary trauma is I used to do a lot of work with the courts in The Hague, and there was a young guy there working who on video footage for, I think it was Bosnia, and he had been there, a child at the time of the war, so he came across an image of something he didn't know had happened, which was like a builder's skip full of heads. He didn't know this had happened. Just seeing this image totally traumatized him. And then it took him another 6 months to look for help, which is the point at which I met him. So he was having a lot of flashbacks, nightmares. And then, of course, he started inquiring more and more about this story, realized that it happened in a neighboring town, heard about the people. So the more he found out about it, the worse it got. So that's secondary trauma. Now, and in the work that you do, about 12% of people develop vicarious trauma. It's quite a high statistic. So 1 in every 10 at some point in their career will develop vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. Now, vicarious trauma is different. Vicarious trauma is the cumulative transformative effect of working with survivors of traumatic life events. And it's a process of kind of change that happens inside you when you really care about others who have been hurt and that you feel personally committed and responsible to helping them. So there's a few things in there, that make it more likely. And it creates a psychological and spiritual disruption to the way you see yourself and the world and what matters most to you. So it's like you get into this state of what's the point of any of this? The world is a cesspit. It's just one thing after another. We can't keep up with what the psychopaths of the world are doing. You get totally worn down. Now, it resembles burnout, except it has the added feature, I suppose, or symptom of having a lot of flashbacks about the victims, thinking a lot about them, not being able to sleep, having nightmares about it. So it's burnout plus some trauma symptoms. Now that has a higher statistic. So vicarious trauma and burnout move up to like 16, 17, 18% of people who do this work. The same is true for emergency doctors, therapists, anybody who works with people who are traumatized. So we need to be prepared for it, accept it as a risk factor of the work, and to know what you have to do to prepare yourself for that, or should you see signs and symptoms of it, to get help on time. The problem is it goes way too far before people reach out. And when I ask people, why have you not said this to your manager or to anybody else? First of all, they didn't know what was wrong with them. But also they feel, I won't be seen as strong enough for the work. I won't be allowed to continue doing it. I won't be able to progress in my career. There's all kinds of things that are in the way of reaching out and telling someone. So what tends to happen is people will believe they have something physically wrong with them, and they might have some other illnesses, but they blame it on the body because they don't understand it. So and they say, I've been doing this for years. There are many people who develop vicarious trauma after 20 years. So it's not necessarily a newbie who gets this. So it's like I was able to handle it for years. What's wrong with me now? So we want to understand it can come at any point. And of course, the longer you're doing the work, and if you go through any long period of a lack of self-care, the more at risk you are. Okay, so signs and symptoms, again, like we discussed the last day, except there's extra ones here. It's different to stress. The physiological signs are similar. So you might have a lot of sweating. As I say, that tends to happen a lot with men. They wake up in the morning, their pillow's really wet, sweating out their neck and their head. Tends to happen when people are worried. You might have a pounding heart. You'll be lying in bed and the heart is pounding. I hear this all the time, I would say daily. They might have a hard time breathing. So, you're finding you don't feel like you're breathing, like you can't get air in. You are breathing, but it doesn't feel like you're able to do it well. You can have all kinds. Sorry, my dog just tried to knock over the thing here. Okay. You might have a lot of somatic complaints, which is, the classic one is headaches. You might have a kind of a choking sensation in your throat, or like a golf ball in there. You might have a lot of pressure on the chest, or kind of strange, kind of nearly feelings like needles going through your chest. And people get really scared if they get that, and they take themselves to the hospital thinking they're having a heart attack. You can have a lot of nausea, diarrhea, all kinds of gastrointestinal symptoms. The thing is, your a lot of your organs, but also our skeletal system from head to toe is covered in muscles, and they can cramp at any time, a bit like a calf cramp. And that's what happens with high cortisol when you're very stressed. So they just kind of go into a cramp because your body is trying to get your attention. It's trying to say, there's something here I'm not liking, please change it. So it always grabs your attention and makes you go, oh my God, what's that? So and what tends to happen is we ignore it, we push on, we have another coffee, we ignore the symptoms until they get to a place where we can't ignore them. You might have aches and pains, which you might have kind of twitching in the upper arms or in the thighs. You might feel kind of dizzy, sometimes actually dizzy, other times just a bit lightheaded, or you might get a lot more colds and flus, things like that. Emotionally, you might have, and people think I'm sick all the time. That's why they really believe there's a physical basis or a biological basis for what's going on with them, and keep searching for. I can't tell you how often I have this discussion with people. They keep searching for the physical illness, like, there must be something physically wrong with me, because the symptoms are big. And then they understand in a discussion about vicarious trauma, they go, yeah, I think it's that. But then a week later, it's, but there must be something physically wrong because my symptoms are extreme. They go to the doctor, they get tested, they find something, but nothing to justify the symptoms. Essentially, the doctor is saying it's not a whole lot wrong. Emotionally, you might have a lot of anxiety. Now, people confuse stress with anxiety a lot nowadays. It's if people feel stressed, they say they're anxious. So anxiety is a sense that something really bad is just about to happen. Anything else is not anxiety. You might have a lot of anguish or survivor guilt. People who do this work feel a lot of survivor guilt. It's like these people suffer like this and I don't suffer. I was speaking to somebody last week who was really struggling with this. She was working with forced evictions, and the children were, their children had starved to death, and she said, I came home from these interviews and discussions, and then I went to a restaurant with friends in the same city, and and she said, and we had this big meal. Like, she just couldn't get the two in. How can across one side of a city people are starving and being evicted from their homes, and here I am having this big meal. So that one can be really difficult. You might have a lot of anger or sadness. You might feel detached, numb, unreal, vulnerable, helplessness, sadness, depression, powerlessness, hypersensitivity, being overwhelmed, depleted, very intense emotions. Spiritually, you're going to have a profound loss of trust, question the meaning of life, a loss of purpose, lack of self-satisfaction, this pervasive sense of hopelessness. It's really a depressed symptoms. Be angry at God or questioning any previous religious beliefs if you because it can make people go like, you know, God, what God would let this happen, and why was I ever believing in any of that? So people get into a very intense state. Cognitively, you can have a really hard time concentrating, get really confused, a loss of meaning, decreased self-esteem. You might be preoccupied with people's traumas, you know, and like sometimes you can be preoccupied with the trauma for a day or two, but like that would be normal, a bit of processing of something difficult. It's when it's going on and on. Apathy, you know, like what's the point of this? We're not making any difference. All we're doing is like someone compared it recently, it's like curling. You know, you're wiping the ice in front. So it's like you're just there, you know, watching what the psychopaths are doing, but we're not stopping them doing it. So having a lot of apathy or rigidity, like what's the point of this if we're not going to do it right, getting really kind of obsessed with perfectionistic standards. Thoughts of self-harm or harm towards others. Now, this is something that happens a lot. I was, again, last week speaking to someone who has quite serious vicarious trauma after a long time doing interviewing. And she said, like, you know, I think I just want to go into the office and kill myself in front of people so that they know how bad it is. So it's intense thoughts, you know, it's not mild, it's a real intense thoughts of hurting yourself or hurting other people. And then of course the person feels they're going a bit mad, you know, like what the hell's wrong with me that I'm having these thoughts. People can have, you know, images of stabbing themselves with knives, and really it's all your psyche trying to say stop doing this. So it gives you these shocking thoughts. You might have a lot of self-doubt, perfectionism, minimization, I already said that. Behaviorally, you might become very impatient, irritable, withdrawn, moody, might have a hard time. Sorry, my dog is trying to get up in my lap. He keeps scratching me. Charlie, get down. Sorry, he's distracting me. Get down. So you might have a problem like sleeping too much, too little, eating too much, too little. You might have a lot of nightmares, you know, hypervigilance, which is this kind of state of, you know, what's that noise, whatever, or checking you're being really vigilant about your own body symptoms. An elevated startle response, which is, you know, a door bangs, oh my God, what's that? Now, if you're having all of these pleasant symptoms, you're going to be doing something to cope with it. So people tend to smoke more, drink more alcohol. There tends to be a lot of substance abuse in field settings. So, you know, sometimes people recognize that it's gone out of whack when they start driving too fast or whatever. So you're going to do something to cope with it. And unfortunately, the coping mechanism tends to make it worse, not better. So, you know, like with alcohol, for example, alcohol exacerbates whatever emotion you're feeling. So the rule with alcohol needs to be you drink when you're happy. It doesn't have a negative effect. If you drink at a stressful time, you're doubling your suffering, because tomorrow you have the booze blues, and whatever you were struggling with originally, tomorrow is going to be twice as hard. So, but it's understandable that you're trying to, you know, these are pretty intense emotions and symptoms to have to live with. You might have a decreased interest in intimacy and sex, mistrust, isolation. There can be a real impact on parenting. You might become, you know, like, oh, you've no clue, you know, you're all spoiled rotten. So you could become very intolerant, or you could become very clingy with your kids as a way to cope with all the things you saw today. Both are a bit scary to children. You might project a lot of anger and blame and have this profound feeling of loneliness. So this is a very distressing way to feel, and it can go on for a very long time. And the problem is people are suffering for a long time before they reach out for help because they don't even know what's wrong with them. So and then it's like, how could you, sometimes people, you know, like not everybody has all the symptoms, you know, you have some of them, but it can also be helpful to notice it in your colleagues. So when people are suffering silently, now this is not to judge them, this is to help them, you know, so to see in colleagues, like how do you recognize it? So there might be a decrease in the quality and quantity of their work, have low motivation, avoiding certain job tasks, you know, like if you're having to face a monitoring time, they're going, oh God, like I don't want to have to do that, trying to get out of it. Increase in mistakes, setting perfectionistic standards, getting obsessed with details, withdrawing from colleagues, becoming very impatient, a decrease in the quality of the relationship, having very poor communication, a lot more conflict. Morally, you might see there's a decrease in their confidence, they're not interested anymore, dissatisfied, negative, real sense of apathy, demoralized. They don't feel appreciated. That becomes a real issue for people doing this work because, you know, I suppose, when people go way over their own boundaries and exhaust themselves and put themselves in situations which are traumatizing to them, and then their manager wants more or doesn't appreciate that or doesn't thank them for that or just expects it, and you're feeling bad, there is huge anger towards the manager, the organization they work with. It's like nobody gives a damn about us, and that becomes a real issue for people. So and I would say it's a big bugbear of people doing this work. It's like, okay, I might be doing it, but don't expect it. Don't start telling me this is the norm and then wanting more when I'm already in a heap. Or people can spend a day doing monitoring work or interviewing, and then at the end of the day, they're asked for information, but nobody asked them how they are or how they coped with that day when it was particularly difficult. And it's like, hang on a second here, like, you know, does anyone give a damn about me? And managers rarely ask. So now sometimes that is because, I mean, I've heard from managers in field presences where they'll say to me, but Erika, you know, I don't really want to open that can of worms because I've seen that happen before in various, you know, in particular if they've been in any kind of active conflict places, where they'll say, yeah, but then someone did come in and do a debriefing and everyone was in a heap, and it was more traumatizing than not saying anything. So really don't like to open up that can of worms. I'd like to leave that to a professional, but that's okay if there's a professional coming in. But if there's not a professional coming in, you know, it creates a problem. So it's really important that anyone in any managerial position is checking how people are. Feeling detached, incomplete. Behaviorally, the person might be out sick a lot. You can see they're exhausted. You might see that their judgment isn't great anymore. Irritable, they're not taking care of themselves. You know, you might see that someone's wearing the same clothes for a week or whatever. That's a real sign people are struggling, unless they're always like that. Okay. But if you notice a difference in someone's self-care, things are quite extreme before people stop changing their clothes or washing, you know. So it's a real sign someone's really struggling, and if it's unusual for them. They might be more irresponsible, working too much. This is really, really common for people in human rights work. So if you're traumatized by the work, it can feel easier to just keep working than to sit with the feelings, because they just become too difficult. So you just keep at it. The problem is it's all building. Or wanting to change jobs a lot, you know, like kind of wanting to move to a different place. Okay, so I've included here 2 scales for you guys to fill out for yourselves, and I'll share the slides later with Kate. So you can fill them out for yourselves. So this is like a secondary trauma scale. So I would say anybody who scores on average 3s and under, then if you focus on self-care strategies, which we'll mention today, then you'll be fine. Anybody who scores a lot of 3s and a few 4s or 5s, strongly encourage you to reach out to a therapist. You can feel free to contact me or contact another therapist. It's really important that you get help on time. People struggle with this for years on end. So to just assess for yourself, okay? And then in the second one is the same one we talked about the last time, which is an anxiety scale, which is more about how stress is impacting you. Anybody, again, who scores, you know, up to 25 to 30, focus on self-care, you're okay. The 25, 30 and up, you need the help of a therapist to get back on track. It's just a bit more complex and more difficult to, well, you can get there yourself, but it'd be very slow. I'd encourage you to do a few sessions with a psychologist and get yourself back on track, because we can get you there faster. So what are the risk factors? So who's at risk? Sorry, So, you know, a lot of people who choose this line of work, they've had trauma themselves, so they understand, um, you know, what it's like, and they have a drive and a passion to help the world. A lot of people don't, but a lot of people do. So they come from they've had trauma in their lives. It's certainly why I'm a therapist. So, and then it gives you a very high level of empathy because you understand human suffering. But the problem with that, or it's the problem, I mean, it's a driver in the work, but it's to understand that unprocessed traumas can resurface at times when we're vulnerable. So they can get activated at different times. So, you know, unless someone hits us over the head with a baseball bat, we have our memories and we have our life experiences. And when things get re-traumatized, tends to be at times where we're exhausted. We all regress, you know, when we are out of balance. So if you're sick, if you've ongoing never-ending trauma and you're you know, traumatic work and you're exhausted. So it tends to be when you're exhausted, when you're sick, when you've other stress factors in your life. You're not just your work. You have your family, your, you know, your finances, your health, you know, and it's always layers of stressors that come together. So that's why at one time in your life it might be fine to do the work. At another time in your life it's too much, depending on other factors. But if we have prior traumatic experiences, they can be reawoken and they impact how we respond to things. You might have, and it's not that you necessarily go right back into your trauma. Sometimes you do, but it just means your resilience can be lower. So people who've had prior traumatic experience really have to focus on self-care to keep themselves in check. And if self-care goes out of whack, then they're just at higher risk. So you might, people who are socially and sorry now, but people who also have a high level of empathy tend to go way over their own boundaries because you care so much about people who are suffering. So, and then people can find themselves in situations where they're maybe promising more than can be delivered or feel they should be doing more. And I find this always with people who have vicarious trauma. Even if I think of this person who was working with forced evictions, you know, she was giving them all her own money and, you know, like really wanting to do a lot more than the organization she works with are doing. So she's, you know, and the manager was a bit angry with her about this, and but you know, this need to do a lot more, and then very distressed by it. So high level of empathy can motivate you to do a lot, but there needs to be boundaries and a real realization of what we do here. People who are socially isolated, both on and off the job. So, you know, and COVID has created a lot of that. I don't know what your individual circumstances are, but people who live alone and are not with other people, work and don't work with other people. Sometimes in this work, it's a solo thing, going out and doing interviews, depending on where you work, or people who do monitoring work. But when you do things on your own, you've nobody to give you perspective on a day where you've had a hard day. You can't decompress with anybody. There's nobody to come home to, or if there's no colleague to share, you know, how hard that day was, and that there's just that bit of chat kind of lets air out of the balloon, you know, or someone to distract you or make you laugh or give you a cup of tea or say, are you okay? Cook, you know, hand you a meal, whatever, after a really tough day, when you can't even think of that. That puts you at higher risk. People who have an avoidant coping style versus an approach coping style struggle more. Now, the avoidant person, you know, is, you know, something happens and they don't deal with it. So they're like, I can't face that. You know, I'll just take a rest tonight and I'll deal with it tomorrow. But tomorrow they don't deal with it. You know, we know if we're avoidant. And you know, because then it builds. Because if someone has to be dealt with, as in you know, a manager needs to be spoken to because something has happened that's not okay, or whatever, if we're avoiding solving problems, they mount in the background, which puts us at much higher risk. So nothing gets resolved. The person with an approach coping style will get over things much faster, because if there's some kind of conflict that needs to be dealt with, they deal with it, it's over. if they're struggling, they'll say, oh, I must contact Erika or a therapist. They deal with it, they get past it. The problem with avoidance is, oh, no, I can't deal, but it's building in the background. And in this line of work, it's a real problem. And sometimes the avoidance is because they don't believe their suffering is valid in comparison to the people they deal with. And also people who have a tendency to avoid feelings, withdraw, assign blame to others in stressful situations, they are at higher risk because they're a bit fearful of feelings. A lot of people don't understand them, or they weren't educated in it in any way by parents or whatever. But, emotions take 20 minutes. They peak at tears after 10 minutes or anger, and they come down again. And they keep coming in waves, a bit like contractions or actual waves in the sea. And if we can, go with emotion and allow a few tears or allow something to resolve and let it wash over us, we do much better than people who try to suppress it. And I have a lot of people who have vicarious trauma who will, they start to get a bit tearful, and then they go, oh, I'm sorry. And they're trying to stop it. And I'm like, just let the tap run. There's no problem. It's just water. Nothing to be afraid of. Healthy, normal, important. If you didn't go to the bathroom for a month, you'd be pretty sick. The same is true of emotions. If we don't let them wash over us, they build. And then there's this big balloon, blowing, and then a feeling that, oh my God, anything could happen. All that will happen with feelings is you'll cry, nothing else. While they're building, the peak is just tears, that's all. Water comes out your eyes, and then it releases. And the more we go with that, the healthier we are, the stronger we are, actually, because you let it up, you let it out, we move on. But people have a real fear of tears, of feelings. People who find it very hard to express emotions, they find this more difficult because, again, you're not letting air out of the balloon. You're not saying to someone, oh my God, what a day, I had to listen to this or that or whatever. You're not letting it out. You're not decompressing. But really debunk this feeling, fear of feelings. We let them wash over us. It's normal human to be touched by things that happen. And if we let them out, we're much healthier. People who don't feel prepared, oriented, or trained for the work, or don't have good supervision in their jobs. Now, that's often the case with young people in field presences or in organizations that don't have enough resources. Then, they get a little bit of training, but they don't, it's kind of down to the gods as to whether they happen to have a supervisor who really prepares them and orients them for, what they can expect to see or hear. And some organizations do that very well and others don't. But people who aren't prepared for it, and I've heard this many, many times, and oftentimes it's like a younger, less experienced person is put in a situation that was meant to be a supervisor there, but then the supervisor goes sick or the supervisor is assigned somewhere else, and next thing they're left dealing with the whole situation without anyone helping them with it. So they're kind of winging it, and maybe get over involved and don't really understand the boundaries, which is what someone who has experience will help someone with, and then they're in trouble, so emotionally in trouble. So newer employees, less experienced employees are more at risk. The longer someone is doing the work, the more chance there is that they've developed strategies along the way or gotten good advice from somebody. But a lot of the people I work with have been doing this work for 20 years. And so it's not always the case, but obviously you're more at risk when you're new to the job. Constant and intense exposure to trauma with little or no variation in the work puts people at risk. So then, some people are just doing interviews all the time, doing monitoring work all the time. That is problematic. And I'm always trying to get this message through, that people tend to be put into monitoring work, and that really needs to be spread out amongst people, because having the same people get this assault to the senses all the time with no variation, or it's different if you do it for a few weeks and go away for a while, but some people are doing it every day, all the time, year in, year out. They are nearly spend all their time on the brink, and they tend to be the people who are, they'll say to me all the time, and I mean all the time, I hear this weekly, nobody asks how I am. Nobody. They ask for all the information. I give them the information, the statistics of the day, but my manager never says to me, how are you? And this would go a long way to, and they'll often say to me, and that's all I need. That's all I need is somebody to say, are you okay? Acknowledge this is hard. So, if there isn't an effective and supportive process for discussing the traumatic content of the work, that space needs to be there. So I do a lot of work with trying to help managers have those discussions, because it's really important that it's not. And as I say, managers are a bit afraid of it. It's like, well, I don't know what to do if people tell me all their feelings. I don't know how to handle it. And and then of course it's helpful if someone can bring in someone like me to do the debriefing, but that's not always possible depending on resources that organizations have. So then they need to have the managers trained in having those discussions, which is not a big deal. There's just a few rules around it, but there needs to be a supportive process for that, or it builds in the background and has people at risk. Wanting your individual work to make a difference to the individual you've just heard the story from. That's probably, in my view, one of the biggest risk factors. Because when you do human rights work, you are taking information for long-term change. So the person that you've just heard the story from, there might make zero difference to them other than they got to tell their story, which is always helpful and healing, because people take, in any trauma that anyone experiences, the part of the healing is getting to this place where, hang on a second, this was not my fault. This was not okay. And I got to tell my story and some organization heard it, and maybe that'll make a difference for someone else. That's the same is true for rape victims or whatever in general society, to stand up for themselves and to acknowledge this was not my fault. It's, and that maybe this person won't get to do it again. But if you want to help the individual, which is, say, what's happening with this girl I was talking to last week, she wants to help the individual family today. Now that's a problem, because the organization she's working for is not in that line of work. They're not coming with the food. They're not coming with a new house. That's not the organization. She's hearing the stories. So but it's normal to want to, but then there are lines you're not allowed to cross. And then of course you get to a place where, like, if you give this family money, then where does this end? But it's normal and human to want to, and so it all gets very confusing. So we have to really be aware in this line of work, you're going for long-term change, not necessarily going to do anything for the individual you're working with. So that's a very tough one when you're really listening to someone who's struggling, or you speak to someone in a very difficult situation, and they get this sense of hope, and you meet them and they think you're going to do more than you're going to do, and people find it very hard then to set the boundary and to say very clearly what we are or not going to be doing here, what will or won't come out of this. But it's really important to be clear on that, because you're being clear to them but also to yourself. And when we see suffering in somebody's eyes, we want to take the suffering away. So it's very difficult. And people who feel survivor guilt and discomfort are more at risk. And then we have environmental risk factors, which comes more from the employer's end. So, unrelenting workloads, that sets people up for problems, because you've got high cortisol, you're gone out of whack, you're out of balance. So a high workload puts people at risk. Now, that tends to be the way it is in human rights work. So, you have to respond to events. So then the workload is high and you can't predict when those events are happening. Sometimes work is predictable, other times it's not, depending on where you're working or the context you're working in. But if you don't have boundaries around work, then you're always driving your cortisol high, and then your perception of everything gets skewed. Okay, so high workload just wearing you down all the time is problematic. If you don't have autonomy over your work, so people who have micromanagers really struggle. The problem with the micromanager or the difficult manager is they don't believe they're a difficult manager. That's one of the real problems, is they believe they're very caring, and they might be very caring, but if you're nitpicking over everything everybody does, you are really stressing them. People who don't feel rewarded or acknowledged for their work, so it's like you're in this place of really working hard and extending yourself to everybody, and then the manager takes credit for your work, that tends to be a last straw. Or they don't acknowledge your work, or another colleague takes credit for your work, and it's like, hang on a second. Then the anger comes because you're always going over your own boundaries to work all the time. So that one becomes tipping points. Obviously what you do makes a difference environmentally. Obviously the person who interviews versus the person who doesn't. If there isn't good communication or relationship with coworkers, it's really important that, and COVID has killed this, that there are, that colleagues have, social time together, because nobody understands the work like your colleagues do. And in a social time together, you get a chance to decompress together, to talk about what happened this week, or to, make sense of it, and share that, and let that air out of the balloon. During COVID, for a lot of people, it has killed that part of the work, which makes it much more difficult, because people can't socialize together. They don't meet. Everything's remote. The communication is just the work, the hour on the screen, and then they're back to it. Obviously, if you are actually exposed to a trauma, you're at higher risk. Homogenous caseloads, we've said already. Lack of organization's resources. So, again, people who are very stressed or who are struggling a bit with vicarious trauma can get very angry if that's not being acknowledged through promotion. So it's like, I want compensation for these emotions I'm feeling. And sometimes the organizations just do not have the resources for that. And there's only so many places or jobs available or whatever, as the higher you go anyway. So it's really important that managers, if there's any managers present, I don't know if there is or isn't, that they are, talking to the people that work for them about their professional development, even if the organization they're in can't do anything for them, but that they give them ideas about things they can do in the future. Because if that's not there, or they don't feel people are interested in them as people, that can be a last straw. Being spoken to by someone who's, poor leadership style is a problem. Being, a manager who's stressed themselves and has some cranky or snarky comments someday at a time when someone's been working like crazy. You see, when everyone's working like crazy, including the managers, then our tolerance level is lower. We're not always going to speak in the most, rational manner. So people have to manage their own emotions before they speak. If you're irritated about something or something hasn't worked, go outside, take a deep breath, go kick something, whatever you need to do, but you don't just give your snarky, meh on top of your team. And this happens all the time when stress levels are high. Go take a breath, go for a walk, do something with that, call a friend and complain and moan about whatever has happened, but do not unleash your mood on people who are working like crazy and dealing with traumatic material. But it happens a lot. And that's often the last straw for somebody. There needs to be a capacity to debrief. There needs to be some regular, can be once a month or every 2 months, but that there is an opportunity to sit together and debrief, and not just about the content of the work, but how are we all? And that doesn't have to be digging deep and getting out everyone's traumas, just that space to feel the manager cares and understands that this work sets a tone for problematic emotions. If there isn't consistency and predictability in the work, again, some erratic micromanager makes it very difficult, because they want to control everything everybody's doing, and then that keeps changing. So if there isn't consistency and predictability in how people are managed or in the work itself, that can be a thing that people just can't take when they're dealing with traumatic people all the time. If there's a conflict between personal values and what the job is asking you to do, this can be a real issue in human rights work. I mean, again, something I hear daily. The story gets watered down because politically it's too sensitive to say it the way it is. And then people feel really stressed at how the truth as they experienced it or saw it is not what comes out in a final report. It can be, so made, adapted for political reasons or sensitivity reasons. People get really, really, again, I hear about this, I would say daily, certainly twice a week, where people are going, we put all this work in. Are we colluding with what's going on because we're watering it down to not be, cause, diplomatic problems or whatever in a place? That one really stresses people. So if there's a conflict between your values and the job, what the job's asking you to do. Obviously, if you're in a place which is very unsafe, which can happen sometimes, you're at higher risk. And if there isn't fairness in the workplace, human rights people are obsessed with fairness. So if you feel that the place you're working for doesn't treat you fairly, then people can project all their anger and all their stress from all the work they normally do onto the workplace. And then it's, this organization needs to change. Get pretty obsessed with the organization needs to change. Now, it doesn't matter how much the organization needs to change. If you don't take care of you, it doesn't matter how good an organization is, you'll be angry with it. If you land in burnout or vicarious trauma, people are furious at the workplace. Again, something I'm hearing on a weekly basis. Nobody took care of me. Nobody cared about me. They just cared about the work. And the thing is, there's no, excuse me, if you land with vicarious trauma or burnout, the employer is not coming to your house to take care of your family for you, or to pay your bills, or to, or to take care of you. It's just, I know, yeah, it's bad. How long will they be out for? How many weeks will they be gone? Yeah, like they should have taken better care of themselves or whatever, which of course makes the person really angry. So it's, that's why you taking care of you matters so much. And to really get this message in, and that doesn't mean that the workplace is horrific. The workplace is the workplace. They're not your family. It's your job to take care of you. They do their bit and you have to do your bit. But the problem is when people self-sacrifice and give all of themselves to an organization, they treat the organization as if it is their family. And then they're quite shocked when they're sick and no one's visiting and nobody's calling, nobody's checking in. Some people have great teams, others do not. Nobody gives them any call other than to say, sorry to bother you, but have you got information for this thing for work? And then they're even more angry. So now I'm out sick and they're calling me about work. So, we need the message to get through. It's your job to take care of you. An organization has its responsibility, whatever one you work for. It has to do its part, and that's more these environmental risk factors. This is something organizations need to focus on, but it's your job to take care of you. Okay, so the next bit is the bit we talked about the last day, but I'll just go over it again. So just like with regular stress, with vicarious trauma, the same thing applies. The self-care part is the same. So these are the bits you can be doing for yourself through your lifestyle, day in, day out. And if you're doing that, these things we're going to talk about, your risk is reduced by 50%. 50% of mental health is lifestyle. And I mean, and the same with physical health, all right? So it doesn't guarantee that nothing will happen. Just like, we all know the person who eats mountains of broccoli and dies of cancer at 35, right? So we'd all have that extreme example. So, so it's only 50%. The other 50% is other factors, right? But 50% control over your well-being is a lot. That's a lot of difference you can make. So we want to be living in a way that reduces our chances. But as I say, it can still happen. And those people who score higher on those scales, in the secondary trauma one or the anxiety scale, it's more complex to recover than what I'm talking about now. This is about prevention. Okay, should you reach your problem and score highly on one of these scales, and I really think you should check in with that twice a year, just have a look at the scale, see how I'm doing, because unfortunately it's often gone too far before we reach out for help. But then, if it's gone too far, you need a therapist, okay? And the therapist will get you back on track. But this is the bit you can be doing for yourself preventatively. And I keep trying to equate it with, if we needed to be excited to brush our teeth, we'd never do it. We brush our teeth because we don't want to have another root canal. All it takes is one root canal for you to understand I need to brush my teeth. We don't want you to reach burnout or vicarious trauma before you start to understand the importance of self-care. And now, unfortunately, that's often the way humans learn. We learn through suffering, unfortunately. But we can put some things in place in our life that are just automatic. And when they become automatic, just like brushing the teeth, automatic, going to bed, automatic, eating 3 meals, automatic, the more these things are just routines in our day, the more we are preventing these issues. Now, that, of course, is also difficult when you're traveling a lot or going to the field a lot. Then, so we need to have it in a way that is, because this work also has a lot of perfectionists. So it's like, I'll do it when I have all the conditions in the right place. Okay, so it needs to be, I can do my self-care no matter where I am. It needs to be the kind of self-care that can happen anywhere. Because otherwise the self-care only happens when someone's not in a difficult setting. So there are 3 parts to managing resilience, or to creating resilience in prolonged periods of stress, which is what this work is. So the first is to manage your thoughts, which is the biggest driver of stress in intelligent people. The thing, it's what I call the curse of intelligence, is overthinking. The thing that makes you really good at your work is to take notice of your thoughts, to sit with them, to take notice of your interpretations. And when we're stressed and have difficult emotions, we have to learn to do the opposite. You need to learn to let thoughts go, to not take too much notice of it. We'll talk about that more in a second. The second part is to manage elevated cortisol, which makes rational thinking very difficult because the physiological symptoms become overpowering. So it's all great to say we manage our thoughts, but if you have constant high cortisol, that becomes very difficult. And I try to equate it with, if somebody's drunk, they are convinced they can drive. All right, now we understand their perception is impacted by their brain chemistry, by the alcohol in their system. The same is true if somebody's psychotic. They believe there's rats in the room or there's insects under their skin. We understand that's impacted by brain chemistry. They take an antipsychotic, the rats are gone. Now, the same is true of high cortisol. Your perception of your life and everything in it is very different when cortisol is high versus when it's lower. We know the feelings when we're completely exhausted, how we feel, whose bright idea was it to have these stupid kids, or why did I ever start this work, or and then we have a good night's sleep or a relaxing weekend, and our perception of our life is very different. So, it's impacted by high cortisol. So we need to be living in a way that's bringing cortisol down. And the Dutch have an expression called, when the bucket's full, the bucket's full. And then one more drop and it's too much. We have to be living in a way that's emptying that bucket out by about 20% all the time. Life will always have stress. That's not a problem. We can handle stress. We just can't handle it at 100, all the time. And unfortunately, that's often the way people live when they do this work, is it's always full. People are running on empty. They're working day and night. And then all it takes is one extra thing and it's too much, because you also have your personal life or a difficult manager or whatever, or your health or whatever, and they all stack. Your physical health can take 2 risk factors. It can't take 3. The same is true of your emotional health. And when things come crashing down, it tends to be that a few things happen at the same time. So if we're living in a way that's always emptying that bucket out 20%, and we take that seriously, you are protected in a big way from these issues. And the third part is to manage your boundaries, to understand nobody's going to take care of you for you. That's your job. And that self-care is how you put on your own oxygen mask. It's your job to say no if something's not possible, to regardless of pressure, to be able to know what you need, what works for you in your life, what your, how you will or won't be treated, what your triggers are, and to be able to say no on time. If you're not able to say no, then you have a real problem in this work. And it doesn't mean by saying no forever. It's just within the day, and this is the same when people don't feel they can, discuss and resolve things with the manager, or it's really people who find it very hard to speak up. Okay, so in managing the thoughts, there's just three things we're going to talk about. And again, if someone is extremely stressed or scoring high on those scales, there's more to it than this. So I appreciate these are just basics. The first one is to focus on what you can control, and particularly in the context of the work. If you are focused on all the things you can do nothing about, you are driving cortisol high. It's putting petrol on the fire, and we need to live in a way that's putting sand on the fire. So, when we're anxious, we tend to be focused on all the things we can do nothing about. So, we're trying to feel safe in the future. Now, there's nothing that can guarantee us safety in the future, but anxiety tends to have us living in the future. And again, things we can't control for, or when people get depressed, they're looking to the past about all the things that happened that they can't control or change. They're over, right? So we need to try to keep our attention on what is possible to control in any given situation. I use the pandemic as an example. We can't control for what will happen should we get it, right? Some person might get a mild version, someone else might die. We can't control for that. What we can control is take the vaccine, depending on our views on a vaccine. Don't start me on that one. I think everyone should have a choice. But anyway, let's not get into that. But take the vaccine if you want to do that, to physically distance, wear a mask, wash your hands. That's all you can control. The rest, then, we have to just go, that's all I can do. And the more you keep your attention on what you can do, and the same in the context of the victims, and the same in the context of anything else in your life, if your focus is on what you can do, and what you can control, what you did get done, what is working well, what was good today, we are giving ourselves dopamine hits, and it's a big protector for stress. Whereas if you're focused on what did not get done, or what's not happening in the world, or what you didn't get done, or what your kids didn't do, or whatever, we're driving everyone's stress up. The second thing is to avoid catastrophizing. Again, when we're very stressed, we all do this, we start to imagine worst case scenarios. It's natural to do it, but we have to catch it. So external life events activate our core beliefs about who we are, who other people are, what the world is like, and what we can expect from the future. All of our core beliefs are formed in the first 9 years of our life in particular, but they get added to as we get older, in particular if there's any big traumatic or events in our lives. But we have all kinds of core beliefs, positive and negative ones, but they get activated through external events. And this is where old traumas come in. So something happens, it activates an old trauma, and we have a lot of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Oh God, I'm just looking at the time. I better speed up. I'll just give a little example of this. Is that I'll use myself as an example. If my father died when I was very young, and then for me, the worst thing, I'm a single parent, is to imagine my daughter on her own in the world. So COVID hits. Oh my God, what if I die? And Amy's on her own. 20 seconds catastrophizing. Another person responds to COVID in a different way. They've had no trauma in their life, and they go, oh, COVID's just the flu. So we all have different reactions depending on our previous life experiences. So when we are anxious, we are often catastrophizing in our thoughts. We're imagining worst case scenarios. Anything that starts with what if is anxiety. But what if this happens? And what if that happens? And every what if is followed by another what if. So if we start catastrophizing, we have to catch ourselves and go, right, stop. And there's kind of the 3-step thing, which is stop. You imagine a stop sign in front of you. You stand up, you take a physical step back. And I mean this literally. It's a sign to the brain, we're not doing this. Check the facts. Is there something I can do about this situation or not? If there's something I can do, do it. If there's nothing you can do right now about that particular situation that you're worrying about and catastrophizing about, do opposite action. So, do something that takes you out of this mood. All humans catastrophize. It's just about catching it. Stop. Is there something I can check the facts? Is there something I can do about this or not? Something I can do it. Nothing I can do opposite action. That means watch some comedy, call a friend, talk about something else, dance around the room to music. Very consciously take yourself out of that state. The more you sit in it and crunch on it, the worse it gets. And again, people with high intelligence tend to sit and crunch on thoughts and worries. And you have to learn how to not do that. Now, again, depending on how much someone's doing that, there are lots of other strategies we can use. This is just a very simple one. And the third part is to keep an eye on your checking behaviors. When people are anxious, they do a lot of checking, and that's a sign that I'm anxious. So for example, someone gets one of these very strong symptoms from high stress, and then they start Googling, oh my God, and then they're gonna, within 10 minutes, they have a variety of cancers and they can't pick which one it is. And so they're checking. The same is true, like it's also normal to check if you locked the door once, or did I plug the iron out. But if you're checking a lot, there's high anxiety. It's a sign that you're anxious. So you have to keep an eye on checking behaviors, and and to understand, the more we check, we are putting petrol on top of anxiety. So we need to, again, put sand. Check once, and then we try to move our way out of the emotion. But understand, with intelligence comes this kind of automatic thing of thinking and crunching on something a lot. And anyone I work with who has vicarious trauma, they often sit at home for hours on hours and hours on end, thinking about how terrible everything is, how it's never going to change, how the world is the way it is, that there's no future for them. They sit and crunch on the thoughts all day. So it's really, really important to learn how to disengage from thoughts, which is meditation, which we'll talk about in a minute. We need skills to learn how to see thoughts coming and let them pass. So the very basic way, the three things for thoughts is to focus on what you can control, what is going well, what you're doing well, avoid catastrophizing, be conscious of when it happens, we all do it, and to try and snap ourselves out of that with stop, check the facts, opposite action, and keep an eye on checking behaviors. The lifestyle part for keeping cortisol down is to get 4 hormones, neurotransmitters going in our brain every day, which is dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And we get that through how we live. So we need to structure our lives in a way that we get these 4 hormones going in our brain every day. And that is a big protector and really keeps cortisol in check. And that's lifestyle. So, dopamine creates exhilaration, bliss, motivation, concentration. We get that from self-care. We get it from completing tasks, celebrating little wins. So every time you acknowledge what is going well, what you did well today, what you can control, you get a dopamine hit. So the more often you do that in a day, the happier you are. Acknowledging what's good about you. I don't mean you need to be doing it every 5 minutes, but a few times a day, acknowledging what you've done. We need oxytocin, which is our love hormone. It increases trust and bonding, increases self-esteem, relieves stress. We get that from, like, say, playing with a dog, sniffing a baby's head, hugging each other, shaking hands, connecting with friends and colleagues, giving compliments, a smile. We need oxytocin every day to survive. Babies die without it if they're left in a cot on their own. So we need that every day. Normal life has that included, but COVID killed it. And for anyone living on their own, no oxytocin, which made them very unreasonable, very cranky, very rigid. And that made communication very difficult. And that's still going on. I mean, I see that people now who've been living alone all this time in COVID, right now, loads of people are crashing. It's like they got through it all, and now comes a new variant and they're like, oh my God. And I mean, they just can't face any more of this. I mean, I'm hearing this a lot in the last 2 weeks. So oxytocin is a real problem if people live alone. So if you do, and that can also happen if people are out on, if you're meeting victims on that, it's much easier because you're getting the oxytocin. But if you're not, and you're during a period of lockdown, or you're on your own, please be conscious to reach out to people to get some oxytocin. And if you're speaking only to people online, make sure you have your camera on so that you can get some, a smile and some oxytocin in. We need serotonin, which is our mood stabilizer. We get that from exercise, meditation, sunshine, nature. 30 minutes of cardio 5 days a week is the same as taking an antidepressant. I can't say strongly enough how important that is for managing stress and keeping cortisol down. Doesn't matter what you do, dance around the room for half an hour to music, go for a really fast walk or run, jump on a rebound or trampoline, skipping rope. Doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't need to be perfect, and it needs to be something you can do in any setting that you are in. Otherwise, people only exercise when they're at home or when things are going well or when lockdown finishes or all those things. So we need serotonin on a daily basis. Now it takes 3 to 6 weeks for serotonin to really kick in and change your emotions, just like antidepressants do. But what you get immediately is 4 hours of endorphins, which is our willpower hormone, relieves stress, pain, and creates feelings of euphoria and pleasure. And we get that through laughter, comedy, chocolate, exercise. But exercise gives us 4 hours straight after that 30 minutes of cardio. So that, that's a good chunk of your life, chunk of your day in difficult times, to change your emotional state for 4 hours by giving yourself 30 minutes of cardio. So we create these through our lifestyle. So we need to exercise every day, just 30 minutes. We need to do 10 minutes of meditation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Get out in nature, meet a few people. It's not big, but if we don't have it, we're not creating resilience. It's really important. I'm just very aware of time. Speed up, Erika. You need to when we're very stressed or anxious, we tend to breathe very high up in our chests. It takes so long for people to understand that breathing radically impacts thoughts. When I talk to people in the middle of panic attacks, all their thoughts are going crazy. And then when you talk them through breathing, fully oxygenate your lungs, put your hands under your belly button. As you breathe in, you push your tummy out. As you breathe out, you push your tummy into your back. Then you fully oxygenate the lungs. It brings the cortisol down. As the cortisol comes down, the thoughts start calming down. They go together. People think their thoughts are individual to them and that they're not driven by biochemistry. They're 100% driven by biochemistry. So we can calm it down through fully oxygenating. I've included some links here that you can, try out their various breathing techniques. And if you want to hear more about them, maybe listen to the other recording, because I need to speed up. Exercise, we've already spoken about, 30 minutes. Here are lots of online resources in times where you're, if there's Wi-Fi, of course, and a field presence and whatever, and you want to do a workout at home. Otherwise, as I say, don't make it complex. Go for a fast walk or a run or just dance around the room to music. Now, the meditation is how we learn to see a stressful thought coming and let it pass. It's a crucial technique. And, a meditation app like Headspace, I really encourage people, you stick on the earphones, listen to the man prattle on for 10 minutes a day and get on with your day. You don't need to have all the perfect scenario, in the perfect relaxation space and a meditation room to make this work. Stick in the earphones. Headspace is a fantastic app. Fundamentally, over time, it changes how your brain responds to stress. And if you're doing it all the time, it clicks in when you need it. And you have learned how to shut thoughts down when you need to, just to disengage from them when they're becoming overwhelming. Prayer is another way of doing it. So for people who pray, that does the job. Or mindfulness. Now, mindfulness isn't as powerful as meditation. So mindfulness would be, but if you actually play an instrument, it does work because you're totally immersed in music. Or if you are someone who paints and does art, then again, you're getting out of your thoughts. So for some people, it really is enough, but for most people, it's not. So, another mindfulness exercise can be to take off your shoes and socks and walk on grass or sand. The contrast between your skin and the ground takes your thoughts from your head to your feet. The idea is we want to get out of the head, and it only works for about 10 minutes because then you get used to the contrast, but that's all you need. 10 minutes a day, understanding I have to learn how to disengage from stressful thoughts so that if I'm obsessing about a victim or any of these thoughts or something's become too much, that I know how to shut it down. And this is how you shut it down. Now, again, if it's gone way too far, we have lots of other strategies, right? We have books of strategies. These are just the few basic preventative ones. Really important that you get your sleep. A lot of people are in bed thinking about all the things they have to do. understand your brain needs 2 hours between, your day ending and going to sleep in a proper way. It needs 2 hours to process the day. If you don't do it before bed, you're going to be in bed processing your day. So if you have trouble sleeping, 2 hours before bed, you write your to-do list of all the things you have to do tomorrow, and then you turn it all off. Do some bedtime yoga, which is in the exercise section, which just takes 10 minutes, and get into bed with a good book. And if your thoughts are racing, try to bring your head back to the present moment. Do that deep belly breathing I was talking about, and you should be able to sleep. If, however, you're someone that wakes at 4 o'clock in the morning, that's a real sign of high anxiety. And it's really important to understand nothing good happens in the middle of the night. The brain is in between sleep and wake, and it's just not able to think rationally. It'll only tell you all the problems, all the threats, all the things that can go wrong. So we have to learn to disengage. Again, this is where meditation comes in on, understanding, okay, engaging in these thoughts is putting petrol on the fire, and we need to put sand on the fire. So we need to kind of, like you'd shush a child, you need to kind of shush yourself in the middle of the night, do some deep belly breathing and get yourself back to sleep. Now, there's some great sleep meditations on the Headspace app for if you wake in the middle of the night, and they're in the nighttime SOS section. They're fantastic. But the main thing is, don't sit and crunch on thoughts in the middle of the night. Try to be doing something that is bringing you back to sleep, learning to disengage from thoughts through breathing. You bring your cortisol down, you calm the thoughts, and you get back to sleep. And if you've tried that and you've tried the Headspace meditations, again, and it's not working, do opposite action. Just watch some comedy for 10 or 15 minutes. Do something different, but don't sit and crunch on the worries. And if that's overpowering, contact me or somebody like me, please. You need to stay socially connected for oxytocin, which we talked about, routine and structure, and make sure you're getting opposite action into your day. What I see with the people who have vicarious trauma, they're focused on victims all day and all the terrible things happening in the world. And then when they're off, they start reading about all the terrible things happening in the world. You need to have some antidote during your day to the heaviness of the work. So you need to be doing something different at night. If you're watching things, watch something light or comedy, or do, as I said, listen to music, or just do some activity that is not heavy, so that you are counterbalancing the heaviness of what you're experiencing all day. And as you said, it's really important to have boundaries, to understand it's your job to take care of you, to say no when you have to, on time, to set your boundaries and set your limits. Understanding nobody's going to take care of you for you. People are often waiting for permission from someone else, abdicate their own self-care to their manager. So it's like, I want the organization to take care of me for me. It's your job to take care of you. Understanding that the risk factors are there in this work for developing vicarious trauma or burnout. So really take your own well-being seriously. You matter too. You don't have to be more important than the victims, but you have to be equally important. Otherwise, you can't keep it up. And just the last bit here is, if you see a colleague that's struggling, then reach out and talk to them about the impact of the work. Encourage them to attend to the basics. Understanding 50% of mental health is lifestyle. Encourage, so they can improve their state by 50% by getting some sleep, eating a proper meal. And if you really see a colleague struggling, cook them a meal. Tell them to run a bath for them or whatever, and go for a walk with them. Encourage them to reach out to family and friends and co-workers. Encourage them to reach out to peer support if there is a staff counselor, if not, to a therapist, and encourage them to discuss their experience with their supervisor. That makes a big difference. I often get that call, what can I do to help somebody who's a colleague who's struggling, So those basics make a difference, and we'll get them through.